Today's daf is daf Yud Zayin. Now, earlier we discussed a gap between the mechitza and the schach. And now we're going to talk about a different kind of a gap between the dofen and the schach, meaning not going up and down, but in terms of, if you were to draw, let's put it this way, a straight line down from the schach, you would be to the left or to the right of the dofen. So you have this gap that separates the dofen from the schach. I'm just going to shut this off. So the Mishnah says, Hirchik es hasichuch min adfanos. And Rashi says, La b'gova, we're not talking about gova in the height, ella b'moshcha, meaning in terms of pulling, so to speak, the schach towards the dofen. And it's shlosha tfachim. There's a distance of 3 tfachim. Psula. Rashi says the avir posel bishlosha. So you have to underline those 3 words in Rashi. That's going to come up again in the sugya. And afil min etzad, meaning going from the side of the dofen to the straight line coming down from the schach. So that's an airspace of 3 tfach psula. Then the sukkah is not valid. So again, if you would draw a straight line down from the end of the schach on one side or the other, it doesn't matter, of the sukkah, there would be a gap of 3 tfachim airspace that separates you from the dofen. And Rashi writes that Mikanani Omer umefarish chad amrinan shebeschach posel min atzad amrinan dofen akumo lahachshir ad arba amos. So we're allowed to apply a principle of dofen akuma when the schach posel on top of the schach, and that is going to allow me to be machshir the sukkah, even if the schach that's posel is up to 4 amos. Now we're talking about a distance of 3 tfachim. Hainu, says Rashi, the chashvinin l'schach ki'ilu min adofen v'nekam v'nichvach lamala. So we take this dofen and we go up to the schach posel. The schach posel becomes part of the dofen. But ba'avira, in this case, when you have a gap of empty space, you cannot interpret it as a dofen akuma, because the dofen akuma requires that you take the schach posel and you connect it, so to speak, to the dofen, and the dofen now curves over. But here we're talking about avir, we're talking about space, and with regard to space, 3 tfachim is enough to create a psul. At the end of the Rashi, he quotes another interpretation of how dofen akuma operates, and it means that roim es hadofen ki'ilu hu akum v'holech tachsa schach haposel umagia l'schach hakosher, that we can magically set up the dofen as if it comes in contact with the schach kosher, and we completely ignore the schach posel. And Rashi says that he cannot accept this interpretation, that it's as if it's magia l'schach hakosher umotzi hapsul min hasukah, as if to say that all the schach posel is outside the sukkah. Imkain Gam gabi avir nami nemihochi. We should also apply that same logic to avir and imagine that the schach and the dofen connect with each other and leave the avir outside the sukkah. That would be no different than dofen akuma. But, says Rashi, dofen akuma could not give me that extra magical jump to continue to consider that the schach posel is outside the sukkah and connect the dofen straight up to the schach kosher. You can't do that. The strange thing is that the Rambam in the 5th parak of Hilchos Sukkah seems to indicate just this interpretation of Rashi. Then you're going to have to ask Rashi's kasha. Rashi rejects this, because if that be the case, then what's the difference between avir and schach posel? If you can cut out schach posel up to 4 amas, why can't you cut out avir up to 3 tfachim? The Mishnah continues and now gives us 3 examples, 3 applications of the principle of dofen akuma. Number 1, bayis shenifchas v'sikech al gabav. We're talking about a house, and the roof is open. And now they put schach in that opening. So how will we apply the principle of dofen akuma? Im yesh min hakotza lasikuch arba amas psula, and we're going to switch it around the other way around. In what case can we apply dofen akuma be machsher the sukkah? And that is if the distance between the dofen and the schach is less than arba amos, then, as we said earlier in Rashi, we see the dofen going up and encompassing that area. So that he has here a little bit of a diagram, and what happens is that part of the schach, let's say in the middle of the sukkah, you'll see schach kosher, and then around the schach kosher, the remainder of what is the roof is schach posel. And the truth is that if we're talking about a bias, let's say, in a case of a bias, the tikra, the roof of the bias was not put up as sukkah, as schach. And therefore, by definition, the remainder of the schach around the schach kosher, which is in the middle, is all schach posel. But we can take the defanos and, so to speak, curve into the schach posel as long as it's less than 4 amos. So you have a case of a chotzer. Now, what's an achsadra? An achsadra is like the old time chuppahs, if you remember, where you hold, 4 poles and you put schach on top or chuppah on top. But here you're not holding the poles are on the ground, but there are no defanos. It's absolutely open air. So now you have a chotzer that's mukefes achsadra. And once again, we have a bit of a diagram here. So there's a chotzer, and outside the chotzer, on the other side of the walls, the mechitzas of the chotzer, you have an achsadra. And once again, we're going to apply the principle of dofen akuma. Rashi says, chotzer shebeshas lefnei abatim, v'abatim psuchim lo, v'chotzer zu mukefes batim mitocha, upsuchim saviv migimel ruchosea, on all 3 sides on the outside is asu achsadros, sviv, lishlosha ruchosea, v'achsadra Psuchah, it's open. The ein lo dofen, there's no dofen l'tzad hachotzer. Yesh oled tikra. V'zech sichech al gaba kol avira shel kol chotzer shebeemtza hekef hachsadros. But v'ein dofen l'sukkah zu. So that means that any sort of schach that you put on top of the asadra is going to be schach posel. Rashi says that yesh oleh tikra v'zeh sichech al gaba kol avira shel kol chotzer shebeemtza hekef hachsadros v'ein dofen l'sukkah zu el mechitzas habatim hamachzikos ben habatim l'achsadra v'nimtzeis tikros hasadra mafsekes sviv ben schach l'defanos. And if yesh baroch of achsadra dalet amis psula pochs mi dalet amis kshera the amrin dofen akuma, and Rashi gives you a German translation. We'll clarify all the details as we go along, because the Gemara is going to ask why we need all these three cases in the Mishnah. We have now a Sukkah Gdola, Sheikifua B'Dover She'ein Mesachachim Bo. So this is Schach Posel, and we're talking about a large Sukkah. What's the deal in these three cases? Yesh Tachtov Arba Amos Psula. If the space, which is now occupied by the Schach Posel, is 4 amos in width, then the sukkah is psula. But just to summarize, this last part of the Mishnah, the Sefer of the Mishnah, which enumerates 3 cases, 3 scenarios, all come under the halacha of dofen akumen. It depends. If it's a schach posel that's less than 4 amos wide, then we apply the principle of dofen akuma. We see that schach posel as an extension of the dofen. If, on the other hand, we have more than 4 amos, then it's going to be posel. So the last case that we had, it was a sukkah gedola, means that again you have schach kosher in the middle of the sukkah, but in the hekef of the tikra, going all around the schach kosher, is schach posel. So the Gemara asks Kol Hani Lamali, why do I need 3 cases? Why did the Mishnah feel compelled to go over and over and over again the same principle of dofen akum and apply it in 3 different scenarios? If we only began and ended with the first beginning of bayis shenifchas, then we would say the following, that mishum dahani mechitzos labayis avidon, since the purpose of setting up these walls, these mechitzos around your house, was labayis avdinon, right, to continue them as part of the bayis, is therefore, we could say in such a case that we can use the walls of that house for a dofen akuma to bend over and continue an extension, integrating the schach posel. And the reason for this is because we have mechitzos that were set up as mechitzos. But in the second case of chotza mukefes achsadra, the mechitzos lav lachsadroy avida, you cannot assume that the mechitzos of the bias will serve as mechitzos of the asadros, because the purpose of setting up the mechitzos is for the inside, to cover the hekef halal that's on the inside, but not to serve the porches and the asadros on the outside, is a malo. Then we would say it's not possible to apply the principle of dofen akuma, tzricha. The yashmin and hani tarti. And if we had only the first two cases, but not the third case, shum this chachan schach kosher. Schach itself has the two qualifications that are necessary for schach. It's a dover chain of a kabel tuma, and it's gidui karka. Avol sukkah gedola shekifu b'dover shein mesachim bo. In the case of a large sukkah, and he places schach kosher in the middle of the sukkah, and now you're going to tell me what? That how are you going to set up a dofen akuma over here? You know, if you talk about mechitzos of a bias, and you're wondering whether or not we can use the mechitzos for something outside the bias, like the asadros, I understand very well. There was such a havamina. But now that we know that mechitzos lebayis avdina, and lebayis avdina means for the inner bias, then what's the havamina in the third case of a sukkah gedola? There was never schach kosher at all in the sukkah gedola. So the Gemara says, "Aval sukkah gedola shekifua b'davar she'ein mesachachim bo." Right, as we said before, you know, the outside periphery of the schach kosher, going all around the tikra, the top part of the sukkah, is all schach posel, and it's schach posel mamish. You know, not talking about the other two cases where you had schach kosher. Is emolo. I certainly have a havmina to assume that this schach, which is posel, is not subject and doesn't lend itself to the halacha of dofen akuma. In the first two cases, we have schach kosher. Problem is machitzos lebayis avdin, but at least we have schach kosher. By the time we get to the third case, the schach itself is posel. Inherently, it's posel. It's made of materials that are invalid for a sukkah. Is tzricha? Now, the Gemara doesn't explain why the Mishnah goes in that direction, you know, first two scenarios and then the third. Omar Rabba. Ashkechetinu l'Rabbanan debei Rav Diasvi Komar. This is Rav's yeshiva, and the Talmidim are speaking. And they say, Avir posel b'shlosha. If you have open space, then right between the dofen and the schach, then as long as it's less than shlosha, it's kosher. If it's more than a space, an open air space of shlosha, then it's posel. Succah, posel, posel arbu. Schach posel, posel barbu. So avir is posel b'shlosha tvachim, and schach is posel b'arba psachim. Biarba tfach. So it seems that we're more machmir in avir than we are in schach posel. So Rabbah asks the following kasha to Rav: Avir posel shlosha minolahu. From whence do you derive the conclusion that avir is a psul once it's 3 tfachim? Tisnan, as we learned in our Mishnah, hirchik is hasikuch min adfanos shlosha tfachim psula. So once there's an airspace, a distance between the schach and the tfanos of 3 tfachim, the sukkah is psula. So now comes along Rabbah and he asks the following kasha to Rav: if avir is posel b'shlosha tfachim, then schach posel nami lo lifsel el b'arba amos. In other words, why are you assuming that schach posel is posel b'arba tfachim? Why not leave it, give it leeway up to 4 amos? Tisnan ba'yishe nifchas b'sichech al gabov. Right, so part of the roof of the house was broken. Is sichech im yesh bein hasikuch lakosel arba amos psula. If the distance that separates the kosel and the schach is 4 tfachim, then the enterprise is disqualified. It's not a sukkah kshera. In any event, the Mishnah certainly tells us that if it's less than 4 amos of a distance, then it's not going to disqualify the sukkah. So now someone comes along and he has a very thin strip of invalid schach, then you're telling me that it should disqualify the sukkah 4 tfachim wide? Just doesn't make any sense. That's Rabbah's kasha to Rav. So if we want to summarize the underlying logic of the kasha of Rabbah, we would say that schach posel, no matter where it is, even if it's in the middle of the sukkah, would not posel the schach or the sukkah unless it had a width of dalet amos. Not 4 tfachim, but dalet amos. And the reason for that is because in terms of the way our Mishnah measures, 4 amos is halacha Moshe Misina. It cannot be based on the halacha of dofen akuma, because dofen akuma requires that the schach possibly be near the dofen, but there's halacha Moshe Misina. Rashi is going to point out on the next amud, but we don't have it for today. And that is the rule of a dofen akuma that applies only, as we said before, if the schach posel is next to the wall. So again, the Mishnah is telling us about open space of 3 tfachim that disqualifies the sukkah. And that applies to both the side and the middle of the sukkah. So then this position, this psak, that regarding pschach posel, only a strip of 4 amos wide will disqualify it. Why is it different than in the case of Avia? And we never say that Avia open space more than 3 tfachim could be kosher. The Amruli and the Talmidim of Rav responded and pushed me aside, says Rabbah. Har minadahi. I think that bar minomeahi is just a way of saying that your raya is no raya. And let's see why. Because the Rav Ushmul Diamrit Shavayu Mishum Dofen Akuma Naguba. In other words, when our Mishnah allows for 4 amos of schach posel, that's because we see the psul as an extension of the dofen, and therefore in what we call schach posel must be at the side of the sukkah next to the wall. So at the final conclusion of this discussion, we see that our Mishnah has really no bearing on this machlokas. That's what Rav and Shmuel are responding to the argument here of Rabbah. And the note that he has here, he clarifies this a little further. He says, Rav is being mechalik between the side and the middle of the sukkah, because our Mishnah is about invalidating the pschach posel in the middle of the sukkah. So the Mishnah allows a strip of schach posel that's daled amos wide, but only alongside the dofen, where we can apply the principle of dofen akuma in the middle of the sukkah, which is more than 4 amos from any of the dofan, for the defanos. Then the question is whether the invalid schach is a chatzitza or it's not a chatzitza. And logically, we would say that a width of 4 tfachim, which is always considered a makom chashuv, that suffices to create this chatzitza, and it really splits the sukkah virtually into two different sukkahs, and each sukkah will have only 2 tfachim. V'amina lahu ano, and Rabbah responds to the Talmidim of Rav, and he said, Ma ilu ika schach posel pachos mi'arba. Let's say you had schach posel, less than 4 tfachim, in the middle of the sukkah. The avir pachos mishlosha, now right next to this schach posel, a little bit less than 4 tfachim, you have avir a little bit less than 3 tfachim, and they're contiguous one to the other. My Shera, should we say that the sukkah is still valid because you don't have enough schach posel to posel the sukkah? It's less than four tfachim. And now the sukkah is ksher. Malye b'shipudimai. Let's take this open space, right, that we have to fill in, and we're going to fill in with shipudim, which is schach posel. What would be the din in this case? So what are you going to argue? You're going to say psula. The sukkah is certainly psula because now what you have is a rochav of schach posel that's more than 4 tfachim. But this is very counterintuitive. Why? Because lo ye avir apostle b'shlosha kischach posel apostle barba. Right, we're more machmir when it comes to avir. We're saying avir is posel even b'shlosha, correct? Whereas schach posel is only posel barba. So the basic logic here that Rava is presenting is that if you want to posel a sukkah, you certainly have to be more machmir with avir than we are with schar posel. Because avir, all you need is 3 tvachim. You're already poseling the sukkah. Whereas in schach posel, you need 4 tvachim. Now, in the case that Rava presented, we seem to say the opposite. The schach, the avir was completely empty, and the schach was, and the sukkah was still kshera, and now you're going to put in schach posel, and it becomes posel psula. So again, basically, if we want to summarize Rava's argument, he's saying that by filling in the avir with schach posel, like these metal rods, the shipudim, then if leaving it empty and having avir, so putting, if you're going to tell me that now it becomes possible because of the filling in of schach posel, then for sure it should be posel in a case where you didn't fill it in and all you have is avir. Because again, as we said before, we're more machmir in avir 3 tefachim than we are in schach posel 4 tefachim. So the chumrah of avir should be greater than that which of something that's solid. So here you have avir, and yet it's still sukkah kshera. Now you fill it in, and all of a sudden it becomes posel. So basically, according to the logic of Rava in his argument, we should really be mitzaref the avir together with the shipudim, and what you end up with is the total width of 4 tefachim, which is going to disqualify the sukkah in the case of schach posel. But there's no question that this schach posel is less chamur, less of a disqualifier, if you could use that term, and it cannot really complete the mitzaref to the 3 tefachim that's avir. The Amruli and the Talmidim of Rav responded, Yachi, according to your logic, Rav, what about a strip of schach posel, which is only posel a sukkah if it's 4 amos berocha? And why not apply the same logic, the same kal v'chomer? Ma ilu ika schach posel be'arba amos. The avir pochos mi shlosha, and next to it you would have open space, less than 3 tefachim. Mike, Sherry, you're going to tell me it's kosher. Is Maila b'shipudim my sula? Why is it possible? If avir is only possible in 3 tefachim, lo yehei avir posel b'shlosha, ischach posel ha posel b'arba amos. And Rabbi says, Aminu lahu anna. That's not a fair comparison. I was talking to Amina Arba Amos. Our Mishnah speaks about Arba Amos of Schach Posel. That's here on the top of Yud Zayin Amid Beis. Mishum Shiura V'lav Shiuru. So if you have 4 Amos wide, that's a shear, that's a measurement that's mafkia, that's posel the entire sukkah. But if you have a narrow strip and it doesn't have that material of schach posel of 4 amos, then the sukkah remains a sukkah kshera. High lav shiruhu. It doesn't have the shear of schach posel, the measurement of 4 amos, which would combine with avir. Evan the lav, lo shavu shiurai la dodi. So the minimum requirements of schach posel and avir are not the same. They're not equal. One is 4 and the other is 3. Lo mitztarfi, they don't combine to set up a shear. El didchu, but your question, the amrisu shear mishum afloga, when you talk about a measurement of 4 tfachim, that's hafloga, meaning it's a minimum that sets up a chatzitza, a separation. So that's not the measurement of 4 amos. 4 amos mentioned in Mishnah has nothing to do with the 4 tfachim. In other words, you're deriving it through your logic. Mali is palig b'schach posel. Mali is palig b'schach posel. V'avi. So this we're going to stop over here, and Amir Hashem will clarify this last point on Yud Zayin Amud Beis. Amen.